Messy and masterful. In this podcast, we speak about the success of people who have achieved, built, or done something amazing, special, remarkable, noteworthy, and/or fabulous. Think of presidents, doctors, chefs, architects, filmmakers, writers, philosophers, CEOs, journalists, and the list goes on and on of people who've had a genuine impact on this world. But rather than underlining their career victories, we speak about the challenges they needed to overcome to actually get there. In each episode, we discuss 3 of such challenges, obstacles, difficulties, and/or hurdles with our guest, putting the messy of their lives next to the masterful. A very warm welcome to you. My name is Alder Bab, and I'm so happy you could make it. So sit back, relax, and download the podcast here.
I think sometimes there's criticism to what is new. If you work with existing structure and known things, then sometimes it's easier also for media to put it in a hole and to comment on it. If it's something new, then people find it harder to embrace it. I think as a principle, we should also make sure that even politicians can make mistakes, because otherwise no one is willing to take a risk. Mm-hmm. I think it was Einstein who said, if you do what you always did, you will get what you always got.
Hello. How have you been? It has been quite a while since Messy and Masterful was last published. So you might not have heard from us for a while, but the fact that we were quiet does not mean that we weren't active. Actually, we have been very, very, very active, and we've got some great new things to come. We're very excited that we are currently kicking off with this episode with a brand new season of Messy and Masterful. And boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, do we have some great things lined up for you. We're going to smash it with a very first interview with none other than a minister, and more specifically a Belgian minister, a minister of the Interior, Institutional Reform and Democratic Renewal of Belgium. A wonderful lady by the name of Annelies Verlinden. And we had the great honor to talk to her about her job and the difficulties around it, the intricacies, and also how it impacts her personal life. It's a great conversation. I really enjoyed talking to Annelies about her job and felt she was very grounded. She was very courteous and gracious with her time. Her team was great in setting it up. She called in from the Belgian cabinet, so a very official office she called in from. And I really enjoyed this chat. Hope you enjoy it too, and welcome back to Messy and Masterful. Really excited to get cracking with a new season, and hope you like this. A very warm welcome to everyone listening. Such an exciting day. It's a Monday. We started the week again, and it's also a Monday at the beginning of September. So loads of things are finding their way in a new academic year. And I'm sure that also applies to political life. And I have the great privilege of speaking for this interview with a genuine, active minister, and quite an energetic one even. It's my great honor to speak today to the Minister of the Interior, Institutional Reforms and Democratic Renewal of Belgium, Minister Annelies Verlinden. Very warm welcome to you.
Hello. So good to talk to you. Thank you for the opportunity. Looking forward.
The pleasure and honor is truly ours, and thank you very much for making time available in your undoubtedly busy schedule to talk to me today. First question is where are you at the moment?
I'm actually in Brussels at my cabinet. The sun is shining warmly here in Belgium today. We have an Indian summer, or what is announcing itself as an Indian summer this week, so all is fine. But as you mentioned, the political year has started lately, I would say, over the past weeks and days. The parliament will start its activities in the third week of September, according to the arrangements here in Belgium, but that doesn't mean that media, press, and all the other actors are back from their holidays. And so we already have seen some political debates on various topics the last days.
Yeah, so you're back in full gear, as they say.
Well, I can tell you that as the Minister of the Interior, you're never completely gone. Also, during your holiday, you have that always on button that is keeping you from the streets, I would say, because every day something can happen. And often it's related to security or crisis management. And so we have seen as well in Belgium in the month of August in particular, that some very actual topics in relation to the security here in Brussels were very actual. And so you're never completely gone, but that doesn't matter. I mean, if you take up this role, you know that you need to be on top of your things, keep discussions also with security services over summer. So that's part of the job.
Yeah. That's part of the job, and we're going to talk about the job, but also we're going to talk about the person behind the job, which is you. And thank you so much to you and your team for, ahead of this interview, sending your challenges. In each interview, we discuss challenges, and this interview is no exception to that. And it's actually a nice bridge in what you just said. You know, what is part of the job and what is part of the person. And I know you are known for being very accommodating to the media, doing loads of interviews. And I really like how you described it, that of course people have a natural curiosity to the person. That's also part of the formula, part of the job. But there's a part whereby you say, okay, this is me personally. You said, well, there's me and there's the minister, but the minister will not be around as long as myself, Annelies, which I think is a beautiful way of phrasing it. Could you give us a little bit of a taste of what that is like in practice for you? Because that is, I think, also something that loads of people struggle with, is like, when does your job end and your personal life begin? And especially for a job where it's so immersive as yours.
That's a very good question, and I'm hoping that I can answer it as clear as possible, because it's also a search. I think it's a search for balance that is never finished. And of course, I'm now in the job still, and possibly I will have also different perspectives when this is all over and you can look back, because sometimes it's hard to, let's say, comment when you're still on the job. But of course, for those who don't know, I became a minister quite overnight, I would say. I was a lawyer for 18 years and I got a phone call from the president of my political party on Wednesday, and on Thursday morning I took oath at the King's Office to become a member of the Belgian government as the Minister of the Interior. So I didn't have a lot of time to reflect beforehand, and maybe that's a good thing, because it was quite a jump for sure if I look back at it now. And of course, immediately you become a public figure, a public person that was not known before. I also didn't really have the time to step up and get used to it, because all of a sudden I was there. And as the Minister of the Interior, I also got to play a very prominent role in the management of the corona pandemic back in October 2020, drafting the ministerial decrees and the royal decrees with all the rules and obligations for people, how to behave, how to gather, how to organize their businesses during that massive health crisis. And so immediately I was confronted with the publicity and the visibility of my role. I said in the very beginning that I wanted to take the time to look into the matters, to study everything that was going on in terms of security and police services, fire brigade in Belgium. But due to the corona pandemic, I didn't have the time to reflect and take a lot of time behind the scenes because immediately I needed to go to the action. So that was quite a shock in the beginning. And of course, as you pointed out in the question, immediately you are questioning yourself to what extent there is still a part of yourself that is your private self, your private life, also for those who are living around you, because not everyone has chosen to have the same job and to be part of the story, so to say. And of course, I can see why people need to get more, to get to know you better, I would say, than the purely communication or pure communication on the matters. Because when you're talking politics, it's about ideas, it's about convincing people, it's about a story and your perspective or your aspirations for the future of the country, and of course also your competence and the area of the services where I'm competent for. So for me, that's a little bit the line I choose, is to what extent does more private communication or more releasing or revealing your personal story help my political life. And I'm convinced that part of it would not be helpful. Here in Belgium, we have a quite open communication between the media, the press, and the politicians. We have seen politicians participating in song contests and very, let's say, games on television shows. I would say if it's really, let's say, not revealing part of my story and my beliefs, my conviction, then I would think twice before I would do it, because there's always the risk that it will block your work and that it will, let's say, get more attention on your private self than on what you try to achieve. And I'm convinced that in the end, politics should be about the discussion on ideas, the clash of ideas sometimes, and not so much about the person of the politician, because we're only, let's say, a passenger in the whole political history of Belgium. And so for me, that's a little bit the compass that I try to follow. And I have participated in television shows that are more about the person behind the politician, of course, but it's always with the same perspective. Does it help to bring across my story and the way why I decided to go into politics from a, let's say, more hidden context of being a lawyer and working for my clients' interests.
Yeah. Many questions arise as you explain this. One of them being, in this tension between you as a person and your job, what do you think is the biggest misconception that people might have around your job? Is there something that in each interview people assume something that's like, well, hold on, this is not how the job is? Is there something that, there might not be anything? I'm just curious.
Well, that's more related to the content of what I try to achieve. And that is namely, I always say, leaving the services where I'm responsible for, like the police forces, fire brigade, but also civil protection, in a better position than I encountered these services when I started with this role. And of course, Minister of the Interior, which is, or you could rephrase it as Minister of Security. Everyone has a strong feeling about security when something happens, and we have seen lots of different forms of crisis and security situations. Everyone has a feeling, and sometimes there's also a limit to what you can do personally as a Minister of the Interior. You work with the services, you also work with the community as a whole. Yeah. A lot has to do also with prevention, on making people more resilient, try to help people making their own decisions, protecting themselves, and that's the balance. And sometimes the desire or the idea from people is that the Minister of the Interior can be on top of everything, whereas of course we work with a structure, with a context that is already. And that sometimes is difficulty because, as you know, in this political generation, we often have the tendency to try to solve every issue, every problem for these citizens, whereas as a political organization or a political actor, you cannot solve everything at the same time. We've seen the same with the energy crisis when the prices for the utilities increased. Also there, the politics as a whole did not have an immediate answer to the issues of the people, because it's also part of an international or global economic energy market. So they're explaining to people what you can do, what you can't do, what you can solve immediately, or where we need to work on the midterm or the long term. I think that's a challenge for me. As you might know, we have a very complex country, very complex state structure with competences on different levels, and also trying to explain that to people, that is sometimes a challenge. And of course, people want to see their issues resolved or at least get an answer. And they don't really care about the state structure. But of course, we as politicians, we work with and in the structure. And so that's quite a challenge.
It's all part of a bigger framework, and people should not identify you as the one and only who can make the decision then and there. It's bigger mechanism. You mentioned just now that you became a minister overnight. They asked you on Wednesday, and on Thursday you took the oath. Before you were working for a big law firm. I can imagine that being active as a lawyer has a different speed and a different kind of decision-making style and just a different energy to things. How do you cope with the differences? Was that transition easy for you, or were you like, oh my goodness, this is a way different pace? This is, again, referring to that framework you mentioned earlier, or is it similar? I don't know. I never worked for a law firm, but I can imagine it's a very different setting.
Well, the biggest difference, in my view, is the visibility, because, of course, as a lawyer, you also work long hours, and sometimes there are urgencies for your clients in terms of proceedings or just getting a strategic advice. But you work with a client and the adverse party, of course, but it's in that safe space of the client and the adverse party. Only in a few cases, big proceedings are covered by media. So that's a different setting. Whereas if you're a public figure and a politician, you have, I sometimes say, like in Belgium, 11 million people having an opinion on what you do, how you say something, how you work towards a solution. And so you have a lot more shareholders on what you're doing. And I would say rightfully so, because you try to work in the interest of all these citizens. Yeah. But you all have these different opinions, different convictions, political parties, the services. So that makes it different. And in the end, you want to do good for as many people as possible. You are realistic enough that it's not possible to please 11 million citizens, of course, but still you want to have an impact that is conceived to be positive for as many citizens as possible. And that's a different setting. And sometimes my feeling is that as we live in a very, let's say, media incentivized context, that it's more about communication than what you do. I'll try to explain myself. Sometimes it feels that if you're not communicating, you're not working on it. And I recently had an issue like that. Although sometimes in order to achieve your goal or to realize your ambition, it's better to keep quiet, because if you go on the political debate with a lot of noise and a lot of opinions, you might ruin your ambition, because then everyone will take its own position, and then you're not, let's say, facilitating a dialogue. Whereas, if you work in the corner behind the scenes, then sometimes it's easier to obtain a result, and that's a balance you need to find. On the one hand, of course, you need to communicate, tell people what you're doing, tell people why some things take time. On the other hand, you also need to be realistic that if you're too outspoken and too opinionated to a certain extent, then it makes it harder to find a solution in the center. In the end, I'm convinced that these solutions for complex problems in society need to come from the center, because we need to meet somewhere with different opinions from the right, from the left, with the south and the north of the country. And that makes it harder if you communicate, although if you don't, media think that you're not on top of the matter. So that's different from being a lawyer. And of course, if you make a mistake as a lawyer, you try to explain to your client, or if things take more time because you need more time to do the research, you explain to the client, and then you hopefully the client will understand. Whereas now it's harder to explain. Sometimes also journalists doing their job are very critical, and once their opinion is out there, also for them it's hard to change or to redirect their way of thinking, I would say, at a later stage. So that makes it sometimes difficult. Yes.
I was just thinking about, before we go into your next challenge, but I was just thinking, indeed, communication is so important, but you need to be careful that it's not style over substance, right? That at a certain point you're not communicating anything, still it's so important. What I also think ties into that is the communication channel in and of itself, because we live in an era whereby anything is practically information, right? On social media, newspapers, new media arising. Do you sometimes encounter that kind of the medium you choose to communicate something on doesn't land with everyone, and that you need to embrace more media? Or do you say, no, that's not a problem, we have clear channels for that?
We try to work with the context of a certain medium. Let's say, for me, X, or the former Twitter, for instance, there are a lot of opinions that are communicated through that matter, but I've never seen discussions solved through X or Twitter. And so I must say that I use it as a communication tool, for instance, to communicate what we're doing, or make a link to my website in order to inform the world out there of what I'm doing or what's happening sometimes during an incident. But I try not to discuss any topic on that medium, because I don't think it's really facilitating real dialogue. You have the feeling that people get more distant from each other. And of course, I try to use these media because people are also using these platforms to inform themselves. So as a politician, you cannot stay away from all these social media. But it's also, I think, the best dialogue you have is with people in the street or at an event. You also see that people are far harder on social media, because I have the feeling that they're typing their opinions, frustration, sharing their anger behind the screen. And if you have the opportunity to discuss and try to get to understand each other better, I'm not even talking convincing someone else, but just to try to understand where the person is coming from, that's helping. And of course, also the traditional media like newspapers and so on, sometimes you have the opportunity to discuss a little, let's say, more stretched a topic, and that's also helping. But we do realize that for sure youngsters, they're not like linear consumers of media. They don't look an edition of the news on television. They grasp what sounds interesting to them or what is presented to them through the algorithms. So you also need to work with it. But I think it's a big challenge also to reach youngsters with neutral information that is not filtered by the algorithms of the media they use. And I think, but that's on the side topic, we really need to train them, and we need to make sure that schools are preparing them for the way information is getting to their screens and in their heads.
Yeah, and real, actual information. And, you know, there's because a lot on social media is, as you say, there's nothing substantially there. It doesn't cater to a discussion. It needs to be 140 characters, you know, and that's it. So what can you say in 140 characters? And sometimes we confuse those things with one another, right? That 140 characters says it all, and therefore this should be the next step and the next step and the next step, while no one really has an idea about what's really going on. And we should pause.
You used to have a time where someone said cogito ergo sum, so I think, so I am. And now sometimes I have the feeling that it's I shout, so I am. And so if you shout, you exist, you're seen, and then you're followed or whatever, whereas shouting is not always the answer to an issue. And that's, I think, also something that is missing, that we don't have the time, because everything is so immediate. for sure, during the corona pandemic, there was always a lot of guessing on which measures we would take, whether it's strengthening or releasing some of the corona measures. And then we did some begging on how much time it would take before it would be on the news sites.
Yeah.
And I think often in a few minutes, even after the decision was taken in a meeting between ministers, it was already in the newspapers. Whereas there was a time, I think, when politicians were only confronted to the newspaper of the next day with a press conference. So it was better times. On the other hand, I mean, it's a fact of life. We can question that, but we also need to work within, and I hope in the smartest way, but also by training people and by communicating. I think we also, for the security services, if you're talking, let's say, courts or police services, there was a time when there was no real need that was felt to communicate. For instance, communication on a judgment, for instance, whereas now people expect that also judges explain why a certain judgment has been taken. People want to be informed, and that's also a new era, I think, where also the security services need to deal with.
Yeah. This brings us to our next challenge, but you raised another very interesting point, that you get a lot of people who are kind of, we had this big case, so I'm based in the United Kingdom, and there was a case whereby a lady mysteriously disappeared, which was atrocious. She drowned, and one day and the other she kind of disappeared. The media got involved, and that triggered so many people to become detectives as a hobby, right? So many people went to the area where someone disappeared, and they thought they were helping. But what they were doing, and the police asked many times, is like, can you please not get involved? Because we don't need kind of hobbyist detectives, because you're actually doing the opposite of what you're thinking you're doing. You're not helping, up to such a level that it was very detrimental for the family. Right. So what you're saying about, you decide among ministers something, then that is directly communicated. People directly want to get involved, and it can have very destructive effects, right? Even though that the people, they come with good intentions. So it's a new challenge, as you say. It's a new challenge that needs to be dealt with. Like, yes, we are trying to inform you. No, that doesn't mean that we want you to become actively involved and, to become a detective with us, or to act as a police officer or whatever it is, because you don't have the skills and training and, intelligence on that. So I thought that was an interesting, almost a new phenomenon, which I don't think was triggered by maybe TV or newspaper, but a lot more by social media, that people, go there and get involved. I don't know if you've ever seen that or whether it's something you can comment on, but I do think, it's a new challenge of a new information era.
Yeah, sure. And we have seen the same involvement from people that wanted to go and help after the floods we experienced in July 21. Basically, that's a good thing, because it shows that people are still involved, want to do good to others without any private interest, I would say. But of course, also to that extent, we need to manage it a little bit, for sure, the first days after those floods, since it was also dangerous. You never knew what dangerous substances were on the surface after the floods, or maybe some very difficult personal situations. So also there you need to manage. But it's true, and then that for me, it confirms that communication is so important. And that's really, in my view, something authorities, governments need to learn. And it's a continuous effort, I would say, because people are willing more and more communication, and not all authorities are trained in doing so. I think there was a time that authorities were just listened to because they were an authority or a government or a public body, whereas now you need to justify yourself, convince people what you're doing. And so that's a new timing. It's not always a bad thing, I believe, but it requires different skills from what we have seen some decades ago.
Yeah. Definitely. Speaking of new skills, going to your next challenge, I'm going again back to what you say, like on Wednesday, you were asked to become minister. On Thursday, you take the oath, and then you start, of course, with new energy into the job, and you want to make some changes. Now, you already mentioned it yourself. You are a minister in a country that's quite complex in its setup, and you encountered certain setbacks that you thought would be received actually quite enthusiastically, but you got an opposite response. It was about a survey, a citizen survey. You started it with the best of intentions to make sure that everyone is aware, that everyone is informed, that everyone can share their ideas. But to a certain extent, you experienced a bit of a backlash. Could you talk a little bit about this journey and how it made you feel or what you learned from it?
Yeah, sure. For those who are familiar with the Belgian structure, state structure, I think I'm not saying anything surprising that Belgium is quite a complex country. We all know Magritte, the famous Belgian painter who painted some absurd paintings, and sometimes comparison is made between these paintings and the state structure of Belgium. And so it was my vast conviction that I wanted to change, not because of the change itself. A state reform in itself is never an ambition, but it's because the state structure should be a tool to make the lives of the citizens better, to help for quick decision making, clear structures, homogeneity in the competences between the different levels, because if there's unclarity, you end up discussing a lot amongst each other, but not about real topics that are to the interest of the people. So that's my idea. And of course, as you mentioned in the beginning, I was also competent from institutional reform and democratic renewal. And so after the start of this government, we started thinking what we wanted to do with it. And during the corona pandemic, it was, of course, difficult to gather a lot of people in the same room because that was considered being dangerous. And so as an alternative, we started a big citizens survey on the future of the country with a lot of topics on the state structure and all related elements. And the idea was that we did that survey, and then after that survey, we were able to take some topics that would be discussed more in depth in a citizens panel or in parliament or in the government in order to make sure we could take this country further. And of course, such a survey is a difficult activity to organize, and it was quite of an experiment because never before we had launched such a broad survey to a lot of citizens here in Belgium. And of course, it's also the result of a political debate on which topics to discuss, how long the survey could run before we would conclude and move to the next step. And I believe, or at least it was my feeling, that right after the launch of that survey, some journalists were very critical and tried to, let's say, not facilitate that experiment. And I think by doing so, they facilitated the status quo rather than to, let's say, embrace an experiment where we could learn from. And I visited some countries in recent months, like Switzerland or Ireland, where they really work with citizens' initiatives, being it a panel or a survey. And I think it really can contribute to the democracy, never to replace parliament, because of course we have members of parliament that are elected to have these political and public debates, but to complement their discussions, because people want to get involved, as we've seen lately in Belgium, when we had a discussion in a citizens panel on the funding for political parties that worked really, really well. And I think if you look at the comments of the journalists, and of course there can be criticism, that's not the issue, but if it's too harsh and too one-sided, then it's also hard to take it with you in order to try to improve such an experiment or the lessons we've learned. And I think it's a missed opportunity for the whole of the public debate to incentivize political innovation, democratic innovation, by not taking what is good from the survey and try to change it. And I think sometimes there's some criticism to what is new. If you work with existing structure and known things, then sometimes it's easier also for media to put it in a hole and to comment on it. If it's something new, then people find it harder to embrace it. I think as a principle, we should also make sure that even politicians can make mistakes, because otherwise no one is willing to take a risk. I think it was Einstein who said, if you do what you always did, you will get what you always got. And in a country that is a little bit blocked and stuck in a difficult state structure, sometimes I think it's better to embrace new initiatives than immediately become cynical about it, so that nothing ever happens, because people don't feel empowered or encouraged to launch things that we have never seen before.
Yeah. And so where are you in this trajectory? Because, there is a status quo. Yeah, you try to survey people. You didn't necessarily get the results you wanted. What would be your next step? Because I 100% agree with you, and Einstein for that matter, is like, renewal it's for the good of everyone, right? To stay in a formula that always works also brings along the same concerns and same ailments. It's just repeating, and to bring the right type of innovation to a country requires maybe changing certain structures or changing certain things that be. What if anything, could be then another way if this way didn't particularly work for you?
Well, for me, what I've always intended to do with the results of the survey is continue it with a debate, whether in parliament or in a citizens panel or in government. And for instance, the funding of political parties was one of the topics that was also put forward in that survey. And we have seen now a citizens panel that discussed the funding of political parties. You might know in Belgium, they're funded with public budgets. And there is a debate whether or not we should allow a greater share of private funding, like in Germany, for instance, or whether we should include new thresholds for new political parties in order to be able to have new parties coming into the political area. But it was a very balanced debate with very young people, very old people, people who had a public role, people with a private position. So it was very interesting. And in the end, the results of the panel were quite balanced, so that even the people who were rather critical for citizens panel said, well, I like what they have come up with because we can use it. And in my idea, also citizens panels on other topics could be organized, but also the parliament could take away part of the recommendations that were done in the survey by citizens. And I think that's what we need to do. Democracy is, we have, of course, our democratic institutions and the balances between the government, the parliament, of course, the judicial world as well. But yeah, people want to be part of the story, and I think we need to do something with that participation of citizens, and not always the experts, because also on television you often see the same faces, experts in certain topics, but people who have the opportunity to get informed by experts that they can listen to, ask questions to, are also able to come up with an opinion, and it can complement the political and the public debate. And so in my view, there would be something that could also help. Like, for instance, in Ireland, we have seen an enormous success of citizens panels. They even had to limit the number of panels that could be organized in 1 year, because otherwise they had initiatives on a high number of topics. If I'm not mistaken, they do 4 in a year, on very relevant topics like the end of life discussion, but also climate. And I think it can also nourish the politicians in order to have their public debates in parliament. Because you also need to realize that if you have elections every 5 years, people's mind can change. It could be that the political election is about a certain topic that is very actual on a certain moment, but not so actual later on, and then you have a very rich discussion, I would think. So that would be my idea. And we will see. I think I was probably more ambitious to see a lot of panels and debates on the outcome of this survey, but I think also now it needs time. We have now planted the seeds, and the harvesting probably is in the next years, but that doesn't matter. I mean, as I said, my term will not be sufficient in order to harvest all the initiatives we have launched, but it doesn't matter. I mean, as long as we're on the right way, it's fine.
It's good. Yeah, and it sounds like you are. I mean, I think those panels sound like open platforms that instigate debate. And that was your intention. Like, let's question certain things. Let's have a conversation about it, so they feel involved in a constructive way, not just shout, right? So it's kind of like, what are we looking at? And so that people also have a concrete idea that they are listened to and that something is being done. So I don't think anyone would be against that. I think you're right. People need to get used to it. And that might be kind of where you encounter a bit of resistance. Like, they don't know what it is. It's new. So therefore, people might be afraid of, of what it is. But I think panels and debate and discussions, genuine debate, right? Focusing on substance and focusing on things that really matter. I mean, it can do no harm. I think we can only grow and learn from it.
Yeah, that's also what I think. We'll need to see how that.
Time will tell. Time will tell.
Yeah, time will tell.
Then going to your last challenge, and your last challenge is actually also a bit more of a personal example, whereby you said, okay, you entered from working in a law firm to into the political arena, and many people thought of the political arena as a bit of a machismo culture, one that you need to be tough to get things done, maybe slightly shark against shark, and so quite hard culture. And what was your take? What was your feeling when you started there? Were you afraid of that? Did you have a similar fear, or how did you experience it?
Well, I must say I thought I was quite trained, because the world of a big law firm is also quite a masculine world.
I was about to say, yeah.
But again, the visibility of the public debate, the cameras that are often every minute screening what politicians are doing, make it, I believe, even more hard and more masculine. And I'm always a little bit in doubt whether I should call it like that, because I'm not the typical feminist who would say, well, it's a big division, men, women. But I think now I can say that still the world of politics is dominated by masculine defaults. And it's just the way we were looking at power that comes from the history we've taken along, and the idea that in order to be a good politician often comes with characteristics that are male-dominated, powerful, decisive, very opinionated. Typically, I would say that are characteristics that are more related to men than to women. In general, of course, I'm speaking like that. Although I think we might need some more female leadership when it comes to taking up authority or building up authority. For sure, also to show vulnerability, to be approachable, to have a more balanced debate and a more balanced outcome for complex issues in society. So I still think, although a lot of men are doing their utmost, but also fighting against cliches, that's what we're saying. If you're a masculine business leader or a masculine politician, it's less easy to say that you stay home for the children. And also there we need to change our looks, because we can think about changing perspectives when we judge women, but also when we judge men. I think it's important that we give them the same opportunities as women. So I think it still plays a role, and we need to have a broad group of people convinced of the same idea that we need to change. And the good thing is that I now dare to use my voice as a politician more than I did before, because as a lawyer, you're a service provider, and I think you adapt more to the context of the client, and it's also hard let's say, confront a client, someone who pays the invoices, with something you feel not comfortable about. Whereas as a public female politician, I can now put that more on the foreground. To give an example, if I visit a service or an organization, I always try to have a view on the diversity of the panel I'm meeting. And not to say that I'm not going if it's a full male panel, but just to raise the awareness, because sometimes it's just something people don't have on their radar, and then you can never change. And I think I can now use my voice as a public figure to help changing that, not so much for myself, but for all the generations that will follow me, and to give them the advice that they need to raise their voices if they don't feel comfortable, if they think things are unbalanced. And that's the only way, I believe, by which we will be able to change that view or that perspective.
Is that something you needed to learn, to raise your voice or to accept you are a role model? Because I think there needs, as you say, there needs to be an awareness of realizing, that you actually are. I think many people might not realize, I mean, your job is so public that it almost comes with the job, but I think many people might not realize that they are a role model that could basically trigger emancipation or giving platform to women who need it, or people of minorities who need it. But sometimes you need to be aware of it, no? Or am I mistaken?
If you're saying that I'm a role model, I still think it's hard to accept, because
you are.
I'm still the same Annelies as I was before. The only thing that changed is that I have now a more visible role as a minister. But if I can be for youngsters, for whatever background, because we're often discussing gender diversity, but there is a lot of more diversity in our society, which might be even more difficult to tackle or to accommodate, I would say. But I think, of course, I needed to learn it. And I think we need to train each other in order to discuss it in a polite yet assertive way if you don't feel comfortable, or if you think a point needs to be made. Because as so many people, if you experience things in the beginning, you say, well, it will be me, I've misunderstood, or it's not intended like that. And in the beginning, you shy away a little bit because you think it's only my feeling, I will keep silent. But now I must say, and that's also because I'm supported by so many friends and also female colleagues and so on, who push me to bring it to the table, to use my role now to bring it to the table. And I now dare to mention it. To give an example, I had a discussion with unions of the police services. It was a difficult discussion. It was on salary increase. And of course, it's always difficult. Yeah. And at a certain moment, one of the representatives mentioned that I shouldn't be angry. And I said, well, I think it's not a very gender diverse comment, because I don't think that would be said to the man if I were to be a man as a minister having these negotiations. And then the comment was, yes, but the former minister, who was a man, was also angry sometimes. I said, well, but did you mention it as a comment? And of course, the opposite side of the table remained silent. And I think that's not to look for confrontation or conflict. That's not the issue, but just to raise awareness, whether on the fact that it's not always neutral what you say. And I think that's still important, because there is an unconscious bias as well. And we need to help each other to make that better in both ways, or in all ways. So I think it's... and that's for sure something I needed to learn, because if you're young, you just try to adapt to the context and look on how things go, but we should not allow certain system defaults to exist if it does harm or if it doesn't do right to the talent or the ambition of some minorities. So it's hard to measure it, of course, but if I were to make a difference with my role as a minister, if I were to pick one thing, for sure that would be on the top 10 as well.
Yeah. Before we hit record, I asked you for what would be your message, like what's the call to action? Like with all these interviews we have, I asked the guest, what would you like the call to action to be? And you said, well, I don't have kind of a website or a book or something coming. I just want people to know that they can lean in, which I thought was so beautifully put. Could you explain that? What do you mean for people to lean in?
I think it's important that if you're convinced that you don't need to shy away from your principles or from what you believe in, and that you can lean in. And if you look at a public debate, or it shouldn't be the hardcore politics, but just the idea that we need to live together, find a way of making this society as good as possible for everyone who is living with us, then we can have a debate. And also for youngsters, if you have a voice, if you have a conviction, try to be part of that debate. Try to share in, of course, a polite, balanced and open way, but try to be part of the story. And what I see from youngsters, if I meet them in police services, but also abroad, students, and they have a story to share. They have something they believe in, they want to go for, they have an ambition. And I would say, lean in and be part of the story. And sometimes it's hard. Sometimes you're disappointed at first instance. Sometimes we all need to learn that good things take time and that it's not done with one discussion or by shouting once or putting a topic on the agenda once, but you need to keep fighting for what you believe in. And I think if you do so, and if we do that with a lot of people, also the non-shouters or those who are more tend to express themselves in a silent or very gentle way are also heard. And I think that would be my call to action for all those who want to be part of the story.
Yeah. So get involved, lean in. You can have your message, but do it with grace and be courteous to one another, right?
Yes.
Let's
and
not,
I think you
let's
can
not
make
try to overshout.
Don't overshout, but I think you can make a difference. And I know we all have these large ambitions of changing the world and doing it in a different way. And sometimes it's with very, very small steps, but also these small steps are important. If you can make the life of only one person better by doing what you do, it matters to someone. And you should not stop doing it because it's not a big difference or not a big change, or it's not the history books we're talking about, but just making the life of someone better. I think it's also already worth it. So I think if we would all do that, the world would be a better place.
Would be, definitely. Madam Minister, thank you so much for your time. We're almost at the end of this interview. Before we close, I would like to ask two questions that I ask to all my guests. Okay. One is around reading. In your journey as a lawyer and now your journey as a minister, is there maybe one book or one platform or one thing that you've read that you would recommend to others?
I would say Lean In from Sheryl Sandberg. I read, I liked very much. And as let's say fiction, I liked very much Little Life, the book of Little Life. And I'm reading Congo from David van Rijbroek, now the history of Congo, and I like it a lot. That's of course non-fiction, the history of Congo, the relationship with Belgium. So it's we all learned the history at school, but sometimes you forget, and I think it's good that authors like David van Rijbroek bring it back in a very digestible way.
Yeah. Nice. I forgot one question. Could you finish this sentence for me? As a child, I wanted to become an
architect.
An architect.
Yeah.
What happened?
Because my parents redid the house, and so I was very intrigued by the building process. So when I was 10 years old, I wanted to become an architect. But then later on, I changed to a doctor when I was older, and in the end, I decided to study law. In the beginning, I still was in doubt whether it was the right choice, but I must say that I liked it a lot practicing as a lawyer. So I think for me, in the end, it was the right choice.
You found your calling, yeah, definitely.
We never know what it would have been when I had chosen the other option. But what I liked in being a lawyer as well is that you can also give strategic advice, help clients overcome their legal issues, and so I think it's also service providers. So that's what I liked.
Yeah. Nice. And then the very last question. Now let's turn the tables. This is the Minister Annelies Verlinden podcast. Who would be on top of your list as a guest to talk to?
Well, if I could pick one person, it might be Barack Obama. I think he's very inspiring as a politician, but also as someone who was able to convey his message with words, with a call to action, with the charms he had. So I would love to learn from him how he does that, what his views are on the actual topics, world politics, geopolitical situations. So if you can arrange that for me, I would be very, very grateful.
Mr. Obama, if you're listening, or people of his team, we would like to talk to you. So you never know how this goes. Minister, thank you so very, very much for your time. I appreciate you have a very busy schedule. So thank you for giving me an hour of your time there at the Belgian cabinet. It's been a great pleasure talking to you and listening to you. And I wish you all the very best in your time as minister, but also, of course, whatever may come after that. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
If you liked this episode, then it would mean the absolute world if you could share it with your friends and or give it a short review on your preferred podcast platform. The more you share your ideas about these interviews, the more people will find out about them. So do let us know what you think. We'd be very, very grateful.
Special thanks to Philip Anderson for our beautiful theme music. This episode was edited by Natalie Piles with production assistance from Genta Metalia.